Something I was reading again today was when Paul, halfway through this chapter here, when Paul basically says about living the life each one has been assigned. There in verse 17, 1 Corinthians 7:17, uh, or even really before that, when he wishes that um, all could be like him, the gift of celibacy, the gift of singleness, there in verse 6 and 7. Um, what I found out is this is very specific instructions to the church of Corinth, and that Paul is not intending his instruction here to go beyond really kind of what's going on in Corinth and for those who need to hear it. This isn't for a quote unquote general second reader audience unless it applies to you. And the reason Paul is so frank, so forward about being single is because of what we see, and we will look at it a little bit more in review tonight, but the concepts of the present distress. Something is happening in Corinth or will be happening soon in Corinth, which Paul suggests that people who are not married to stay unmarried. It could be potentially, like I brought up last week, it could be a temporary thing. But there's something in this present distress. And so, because to be honest with you, I've read 1 Corinthians 7 multiple times in my life, right? 6, 8, 10 times, as well as some of the other chapters in Corinthians. But I was always like, man, I guess I never fully understood. Paul is pretty adamant about staying. If you're single, stay single if you can. Why? Because I mean, if you look at the longevity and the growth of the church, and of course God's in control, Christ is in control, He's the head of His church. But you would think that we would, like it states in Genesis in the creation story, procreate and raise Christian, God fearing children, and if we can, and those types of things, be a great influence on them. But what I read today was it all centers on the fact that there is present distress. Okay. Um, which we'll get to, I guess, here in just a second. We'll talk about that here. So as far as review, because I want to get through the chapter, and I should be able to. It's only 15 verses, and 5 or 6 of those are review. But in verse 25 here, it says, "Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give you my judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy." Okay, Paul states uses this kind of language in the second half of, or in the middle there of this verse. I have no command for the Lord. In other words, what I'm going to teach you is not a direct command, a direct teaching of the Lord to either his apostles, disciples, or his followers, nor was it anything that Paul would have been taught in his experience um, uh, just after his conversion, right? So he is giving his, it's not so much his opinion. Well, I guess it is his opinion, his inspired opinion as being an apostle. What's worked for him? The Greek word there for betrothed simply means virgin. Okay, that's what it means. Is someone who has never wed, who has never experienced that type of relationship. Okay, betrothed can be both male or female. Okay, many times here in 1 Corinthians 7, it seems clear he's talking about a woman, and other times he means both men and women. And I'll try to clarify that as we go on here. So he's about to give instruction. Not This is not a direct command. This is, as we say sometimes, this isn't a salvation issue, right? You ever had discussions with people and you start debating on maybe some thing, right? Little kind of something. Oh, what's this in scripture? And then at the end of the day, sometimes we say, well, that's really not a salvation issue. And so he's saying, look, this is my inspired apostleship opinion that and it's supposed to be taken serious um, because of the Lord's mercy. He is trustworthy. I think, verse 26, I think that in view of the present distress. Okay. So last week we talked about what this present distress could potentially be. I read, again, reading and preparing as a little bit of review and to finish the chapter. Some scholars, and there's not many, I'll be honest with you, but someone suggested maybe it's a famine. Well, would a kind of a temporary famine be justification for saying, "Hey, look, if you're single, it's really important that you stay single"? To me, that I didn't think so, and because of most scholarship and even history doesn't necessarily record in detail any type of famine during this time in history. So if we also understand, last week we talked about who the emperor was of Rome during this time, and it was Nero. Nero was a bad dude. Okay, he took over the throne, if you will, when he was just 13 when his father passed away, and he ruled for not all that long. If I want to, the dates again, I left papers on my desk and I meant to bring them. Today was kind of an interesting day. These kids want to be done with school, and unfortunately, we still have 10 weeks. So tell them buckle up. We're not done yet. But anyways, I'm digressing. My brain's a little scattered this evening. But he would have assumed the throne probably like 50, in the mid 50 AD, 55ish, 56, until he actually takes his own life in 68 AD. Okay, so he would have been what, in his 30s, late 30s maybe. Um, but he is really the emperor who is the first, as a Roman official, as the head of the Roman Empire, to really bring severe persecution onto the church. Now, most of this happens, it happens before the Great Fire of Rome, okay? And the Great Fire of Rome, I'm going to look it up just to double check, but I believe it happens the year of his death or just before it in 66 or 68 AD. And what happens here is history strongly suggests, that it was Nero himself or his officials, his direct men who he rubbed elbows with, who started the fire which consumed a huge portion of the city of Rome. And to save face from embarrassment, he blamed it on the Christians. And as a result, they rounded up Christians, they imprisoned them, they beat them, they killed them, they tortured them. And that was really the first time in history where we see a Roman official um, being being one to persecute Christians from the Roman Empire. Up to this point, it was heavily the Jews still that were persecuting Christians. Um, but Nero kind of kicks it off. And really, from Nero to Constantine, if you look at history, some emperors were slightly kinder to Christians, and others were just as bad. So I think it's important that we realize that it's not 250 years or 300 years of just constant torture and imprisonment and death, because it wasn't really like that. It certainly wasn't favorable to Christians, but some emperors did not, I guess, for the lack of better terms, hate or have such a disdain for Christians as others did between Nero and Constantine. Um, I'm looking this up real quick. It happened in, I guess, 64 AD. So this would have 4 years before Nero took his life. So between 64 AD and 68, Christians suffered real severe persecution. So something is going on, and I believe that the church, the Roman Empire, is persecuting Christians um, pretty severely. And if we understand when First Corinthians was written, it's written right around the time of this great fire. Depending on the timeline you use, it's right around 64, give or take a couple of years, right? So Paul is likely indicating severe persecution, okay? And that has to impact our understanding of why Paul suggests that some people stay single, okay? Ben, if you're in fear for your life, Okay, and I don't mean because you're on duty or not. I'm just saying, it, if people are after you, would it be easier for you to protect yourself alone or your wife and your three boys? So, so a lot of what Paul will, and that's true, right? I mean, and so when Paul gives this instruction, it's going to be because if you remain single, if you have that gift, it's because one, you can focus on the Lord and give your full attention to Him, be concerned with spiritual holy matters, and two, during this persecution, it's yourself, right? Back here in the mid 60 A.D., I don't think they had pretty good life insurance policies like we have today. And if the man of the house, if the father, if the husband, if he is killed because of persecution or whatever, really history shows that widows and orphans are almost destitute. Okay? Yes. You would think, but remember what James writes in his epistles about what is pure and undefiled religion. See, unfortunately, in the Jewish culture, widows and orphans were not treated very well at all. So to suggest like, oh, that someone would step up, no, I mean, not necessarily. And remember, the church is in its infancy in Corinth. So this concept of taking care and taking up a collection and those types of things, we don't know how established that is yet there. But as history shows, and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, but as history shows, we do know that most orphans and widows, they were almost destitute. But men, right? If a widow, for example, because I explained the language between I explained the language between married and unmarried there in somewhere in the first half in verse 10 and 11. The married and unmarried. Some suggest that it means widow or widower, and not necessarily someone who's not currently married, um, which could imply to anybody, and it could be for any reason that they're not married. But what I was saying is that history shows that unfortunately widows and widowers were kind of destitute. There's also qualifications for certain widows to um, be taken care of by the church, but and because of, I don't want to say burden like, but because there were certain requirements so that certain qualifications had to be met by widows to be taken care of. If you were young, the encouragement was, and if you were a widow, is to try to remarry potentially. Apparently, not here in Corinth at this time, or to work, do something, right? Unless you were older in age. So that's part of it. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Right. Well, and any of us who have been married, other than Serena and I's marriage, because it's super easy. I mean, it's like water off a duck's back. Like Lionel Richie says, easy like Sunday morning. No, anybody who's been married understands that there are other concerns, and then we're going to get to that. It's kind of some new stuff here. So let's keep going here. So again, he's saying, look, if you are a virgin and you're not married, and you perhaps are the remember the engagement process sometimes lasted months or even years, and the father of the young girl, the woman, would have kind of been in control of when he releases her to get married or not, or these types of things, right? So again, the present distress indicates persecution of one level or another, whether Paul, being inspired, knew that it was going to get worse real quick or it was already significant right now. And I'll suggest that it's already probably significant now. It's going to get worse, but it's all significant. And we're going to have a cross reference in a moment. We're going to go to the second letter of Corinthians that we have. So it is good for a person to remain as he is. Again, talking about virgins there in verse 25, okay? 27 says, "Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free." Okay? So if you are married, don't try to undo the marriage, even though there's difficult times outside of your marriage. I'm not talking marriage difficulties. I'm talking about this present distress Paul talks about. He's saying, "Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry," I'm in verse 28, "if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who will marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that." So, worldly troubles, and then look over real quick at verse 32. 32, you're going to see the word anxieties, anxiousness. By the way, I'm in the ESV, okay, so yours might be slightly different. But in 32, it talks about anxieties, anxiousness. Verse 33, anxious about worldly things, okay? There in verse 34 towards the end says worldly things. Don't think of these things as sinful things. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about common concerns that married people have, right? Um, Paying for gas and groceries right now is something we can relate to. I mean, those are things that concern us. Kids involved in sports, right? Sometimes just making the ends meet, right? Tension within the marriage itself. Because we're human, right? We're human. But he's saying, so the worldly troubles aren't these concepts of sinful things. They're concepts of what people who end up being married and have children go through on a day in and day out basis. Right? That's what they mean. Extra concerns. In fact, that's really what in verse 32, free from anxieties and anxiousness, it's not literally this anxiety or fear, it's more like concerns. Like extra concerns, being overburdened with some of these concerns. And like Ben said, if I'm married and there's severe persecution and I'm trying to protect my family, I don't have to I'm not allowed to look out just for numero uno, right? As my dad used to say, streets of New York named after you, one way, you know. I'm on ship, pull up the rope, these concepts of me, 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 I got to look out for my entire family. That takes away from not only peace that we're supposed to have in our marriage, but also it takes away from our focus in our purpose to focus on the Lord. Okay, so they're saying if a woman who is a virgin, who may be engaged or wants to get married, if she does that, she has not sinned. Why? Because the Lord never commanded that. And Paul's really not trying to command that. And like I said, I think it's important for us to understand this is very specific reason to the, excuse me, very specific, detailed writings to the church in Corinth and to anybody who can accept these things, who are able to be single. Okay. Um, so he wants to kind of his wisdom, right? And I've suggested before, and we don't know for absolute certainty. It's somewhat speculative, but Paul may have been married. He's not right now. 100% he's not right now. And I told you a compelling article that an essay that I read about that language, widower versus widow, and married and unmarried, because in the Koine Greek, they didn't have a word back then for single. Okay? And so this concept of being unmarried, if we were back in historical context, first reader, married, single, what would that have been? But widow and widower would have been understood just like virgin. Okay? So he suggested that Paul was married at one time and his wife either passed away or left him because he became a Christian. That's kind of speculative. It's extra biblical. I think it's interesting, but it bears not a lot of significance here because without a doubt, no matter what, we know Paul's single right now because he says he is. Okay? He says he is. Verse 29, it says, "This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short." The appointed time, okay? Some scholars are suggesting that this appointed time concept is that Paul thought, or Paul knew potentially, that the Lord was coming back very soon in writing First Corinthians. I don't think that's very fair in all of Paul's eschatological writings, which just means end time writings. He always writes in the sense that we're always in the last days, right? From the moment Jesus ascends and the establishment of the church till Jesus comes again, we're in the last days, right? So when it talks about the appointed time has grown very short, perhaps he knows of this incoming present distress. Okay, from now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. Paul is not saying don't be concerned and don't love your wife and don't enjoy that marriage. He's not saying don't take care of your kids. He's not even saying to don't go about doing your daily things, part of your job, whatever you need to do to make ends meet. He's not saying that. What he is saying is, instead of focusing on those things, instead of making that the number one priority in your life, focus on God. That's what he's really saying. Especially when you're facing persecution. Because if it when we're facing extreme persecution, when we're facing extreme persecution, I want to make sure my heart, my full armor of God that we read about in Ephesians, I want to make sure that that's bulletproof. Because I don't want to be faced one day with denying Christ. But if I'm not focusing on the Lord, even during difficult times, and I'm over here taking kids to hockey or whatever I'm doing, if that becomes the priorities in my life, um, I, I'm no longer focusing on the Lord as much as I should be. When I read the very last sentence of verse 31 there, for the present form of this world is passing away, one piece of scripture came into my mind, and there could be potentially eight other scriptures that comes into your mind. But one of the very first years I went to YBC in my early 20s to be a counselor, the theme of that YBC for those kids was centered on a passage from Second Corinthians chapter 4. Will you turn with me to Second Corinthians chapter 4? Second Corinthians chapter 4, starting in verse 16. This is why I also believe that Paul knows of imminent persecution, imminent distress, and danger, because of what he says here in just a moment. And we're going to get to it. It says, Second Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 16, it says, "So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day." You want to know what the difference between flesh and spirit? It's a pretty good example. All over the first half of Romans, the difference between flesh and spirit, our outer self versus our inner self. Okay? Verse 17, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. So by the time Paul writes Second Corinthians, they're going through some affliction. Now, when he says light and momentary, he doesn't mean literally that it's no big deal. They're not getting whoopings with a paddle. He's trying to talk about the stuff that we're experiencing right now as he writes this letter, the Christians in Corinth, right? But this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient. Your Bible may say temporal or temporal. But the things that are unseen are eternal. What a great theme that year, and what a great passage. I mean, that includes everything. The things that we see, the things that we partake in, right? Um, the cars, the clothes, the jobs, the houses, the money, the games, the foods. I mean, If that becomes kind of our focus in life, those are the transient temporal things. All that stuff. And those things will cost you your soul if if those things become your priority, whether you're married or not. But the things that are unseen are eternal, the heavenly things. I've said this numerous times. You know what? We just got to start thinking eternally. That's such a difficult thing for humans to do, I believe, because of our flesh, especially in our Western cultures, right? Or our Western culture, our Western societies. I mean, there's places that you couldn't go out and golf every Monday. I wish I could. I wish my body could handle it. I'm awful at golf. Yeah. So, but 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 what I'm getting at is, and I know many of us don't put those things beyond, or we put them in in their proper place. But I love this passage because I think that's what he's getting here. Is look, you're married, great, but you know what? Don't necessarily put your marriage above God. Christ has to be in the middle of your marriage. And imagine that. I mean, those are the things. Fortunately, we had good premarital counseling, and those were the things that we discussed. Christ has to be in the center, literally in the center of our relationships to our spouses in order for us to be successful. And that means putting Christ in the center means so many things. It's humility, it's forgiveness, it's selfless living. It's all kinds of things that go in there when we talk about Christ in the middle. But anyways, I really like 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 16 through 18 there, as I think that's what Paul's getting to here. He's not saying don't love your wives, don't take care of your wives, don't take care of your family, don't mourn, right? Don't do business. He's saying just remember those things are passing away. They're transient, they're temporal, right? We often joke about this, right? You've never seen a hearse with a U-Haul connected to it. We can't take our stuffs with us. And honestly, we shouldn't want to. What we have in heaven is going to be far better than anything we have down here. What does that mean? What does it look like? We live here in the present. I know. It's a struggle for me too. All right, if I really don't hurry up. Verse 32, it says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord and how to please the Lord, okay? So anxieties and anxiousness, concerns, overburdened, right? I don't want to give you too much on your plate. What happens when we get too much on our plate? My dad knows. For me, I get really stressed out. And he knows that when I get stressed, if I can't snap out of it, by going to the gym or jumping in the jacuzzi or just relaxing, that if I spend too many days, too many weeks stressed, it's going to start to affect my mental health a little bit. But he's saying, I don't want you to be overburdened. When you have a marriage and a family and jobs and homes and cars and you name it, right? You're going to have a lot of concerns. But the unmarried man, he doesn't have to worry about pleasing his wife and taking care of his children and providing for his entire family, not just for himself. Verse 33, but the married man is anxious about worldly things and how to please his wife. Again, these worldly things aren't sinful things. It's what I already explained. It's what I already described. Verse 34, and his interests are divided. That was when that hit me, I was like, whoo, right? And my first thought was, even though we're not talking the same language as Jesus here in the Gospels, but no person can serve two masters. Now, we have to keep that in context. We have to keep that in context. Because what they're describing there is someone who basically loves money, has to have, wants to have as much money as possible. And so when they're talking about two masters there, that's something different. But that's the first thing that crept into my mind. But you know what? It is truly a little bit easier not to be so divided in the sense of well, here's my devotion and my time for the Lord, and here's my devotion and time for the God, for my family, for my wife and my kids, is if you put Christ in the center of your family. Have a daily prayer. And by the way, this are such good ideas, and because we're so weak, we started one 6 8 months ago, and man, like clockwork for 4 to 5 months, we were having devos 2 3 times a night. We were having prayers on the other nights that we didn't have devos, long prayers. The kiddos participated, and then look what happens. I'll be the first to tell you, in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we're hitting prayers twice a week. Did a devo once 2 weeks ago. Hadn't done one before that in 4 weeks. So I get it, but when we put Christ in the center, it helps us to not have our interests so divided. And of course, if you're single, your interests aren't divided, or they shouldn't be divided. They should be focused on the Lord. As we continue there in verse 34, it says, "And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband." Okay, we've already covered that. Verse 35, "I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord." So he's not saying that you have to stay single. He started off the chapter by going, "Hey, look, uh, fellas, if you struggle with the desire to have that type of eros love, that erotic love, the Greek word, one of the Greek words for love is eros, right? If you desire that and you don't control yourself very well, get married. Get married." So he's not saying don't get married. He's not putting an additional restraint upon us, but he's trying to say, look, this is for your own benefit. It's about to get bad here. This persecution, this stuff that's going to happen, it's going to get nasty. And if you're single, when that happens, you just have to worry about yourself and your relationship to the Lord. When you're not, you got to worry about all this other stuff. Which again, today, many of these concepts seem very foreign to us, especially if you are, an 18, 20, 24-year-old individual in our Western culture, in our Western society. Yeah, we're getting married, like, many of us do. Um, but again, what's the purpose of his instruction here to the church in Corinth? Yes, right, sure, right. So again, and I know but something's going on. Paul, this is almost extra, if you will. Paul gives us instruction because of the present distress, and probably the issues in general that are going on in Corinth. Um, a, 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 a congregation who's only been established for 4 years max, and they're having serious problems. I don't get me wrong, like I agree. I agree about marriage is wonderful. Wayne, when we had the Sweethearts Dinner, talked about the second greatest institution ever created. And I'm in agreement with that. I guess I'm just emphasizing Paul's position here. So let's keep going. So he's encouraging these young Christians, right? Real young Christians, not having grown up in the church, if you will, not being a third, fourth generation in the church. These very young Christians to try to stay single for a number of really important reasons. Verse 36 says this: "If anyone thinks he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, If his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. So this was very interesting. I was trying to find scholars sometimes muddy the water, and I don't know if it needs to be muddied, but I found this very interesting about the very first part of verse 36 there could potentially be talking about a father who has a daughter who is a virgin who is potentially engaged to another individual. In the Jewish culture, it was common for women, young women between the ages of 16, 17 to 20 to get married. That was kind of the window. That was the prime opportunity. In the Gentile or the pagan cultures, it was 30 to 35. So big difference, right? But what I found was this could potentially be a father who um, is forcing his daughter to not go ahead and get married, right? How does that kind of fold out or unfold in the rest of the context here? I don't know, but let's keep going. Where it says, "If his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin." So, if the passions are strong, doesn't have to do with necessarily the man or the future husband here. It could be the fact that this father could have potentially vowed his daughter to live a life of celibacy, to remain a virgin for a significant amount of time, maybe her whole life. Um, and so his passions, his desires to keep her um, married, to keep her from being married, potentially is what is being talked here. On the other hand, if this is indeed a future husband and they are engaged and his passions, that sexual passion, is so strong, then the father needs to release, if you will, his daughter to get married. Okay? And that when he does that, even though he potentially made a vow or he told his daughter she will remain a virgin, if when he gives that up, he will not have committed sin. Okay? Verse 37, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. Okay. Again, it was interesting because to me it doesn't sound like that this is language of a father who has a daughter and is trying to keep her in that state. This is more to engaged people. But the further I read, it's because I'm reading that with, again, our Western eyes, our current cultural eyes. Um, so if they can stay single, they will do well. Very, very last part of verse 37. Verse 38 says, so then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. Okay? Again, keeping it in context, it has to do with the present distress, the situations going on in Corinth, and what Paul is trying to encourage these young Christians to do. It's almost as if Paul's saying, are you sure you can handle marriage right now? You guys got a mess down there at Corinth. And oh, by the way, you also are going to be going through some severe persecution, some distress. Okay, let's finish this up because this is kind of it right here. It says a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Right? Only in the Lord. It's really interesting, and I'm going to share this because I got young people. I got young people in here. Many of us in this congregation we married or were engaged with somebody who wasn't necessarily a Christian, either yet or whatever. And those things can work out. But I believe Paul would encourage people then and certainly people today to try to marry within the Lord. Okay? Um, Before in this letter, when he talks about how do you know if you're going to save your unbelieving spouse, right? Um, so a lot of scholars believe that Paul also would encourage that to happen, and it can be successful. I mean, I'm a product of it. Okay. Um, but here, the wife is bound to her husband. Again, I said this before. Even when Jesus speaks in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, and Luke, I think it's Luke 16, Luke 18, when he's talking to the record about the Pharisees asking these Jewish religious self-righteous individuals, can I marry for any reason? I don't believe that Jesus is necessarily teaching something new. He's not bringing something new. He's rather trying to show them their hypocrisy, especially the men, as well as you've messed it up from the beginning. You've messed it up from the beginning. It's never been God's desire, God's intention for divorce to even happen. Okay? A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to marry to whom she wishes, okay, only in the Lord. Okay? In verse 40, as we finish this, yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So there he is saying that when he says, I think, I went back and I looked, or it just happened to be in the commentary I was reading. This word, this Greek word for think, was probably actually mis translated into English because what I found was it should have been, or can be, or normally is the concept of I know, I'm assured that I too have the Spirit of God. So again, and that has to do with His judgment. So the concept of I think I too have the Spirit of God, he's not saying, well, there's doubt about someone who's single, who has been immersed, who has become a Christian, who has received the gift of the Holy Spirit, that they wouldn't there wasn't any doubt that that person too would have the Spirit of God, like Paul being single and having this conversion experience. But rather, it that is tied to the Spirit of God is tied to the very first part of verse 40, where it says, yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. Because of the present distress, because of the issues at Corinth, and because she can be solely focused on God. Now, this works if both she and anybody else can remain self controlled. And by that, we know what we mean. Hey, thank you very much. We'll finally be in chapter 8 next week.
Jason, I know what you mean by the kids acting a little bit squirrely, and I wrote 3 referrals today in one period. Dumb, stupid stuff. That's sometimes what they do. Well, good evening. It's good to see everybody. Uh, when I found out on Saturday, and thanks to Angela for texting me that I had the Devo tonight, I started thinking about what do you want to talk about? And so nothing really came to mind. And on Monday, I sat at the computer and I searched for devotional topics and came across lots of them. But I found one that kind of struck a nerve, and so I want to share it with you this evening. It's called "Do What You Can Do." Posted on the wall of the fitness center were the words of the great basketball coaching legend John Wooden, who said, Don't let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. The implications are obvious when it is applied to physical fitness. Should I let the fact that I cannot walk on the treadmill for 60 minutes keep me from walking on it for 30 minutes? And if I cannot do a certain exercise with 100 pounds of resistance, should I give up and refuse to try it at 80 pounds? Of course not. Instead, I should do what I can do. Similarly, in the spiritual realm, much good is left undone because we focus on what we cannot do rather than on what we can do. The pitiful tragedy of the one talent man, as described in Matthew 25, is the fact that he didn't do a thing with the money he had been given. He excused his inactivity by telling his master that the risks of faithful stewardship were too great. We see that in Matthew 25, 24, and 25. At the very least, he should have deposited his master's money in the bank and drawn interest. Now, although we should not press the details of a parable too much, but I wonder if we play the I wonder if game. I wonder if the one talent man may ever have compared himself to the 5 talent man. If so, then he may have justified his own neglect, saying, if I only had his 5 talents, then I could do great things for the master. Such is the heartache of wasted opportunities. In contrast, happiness is found when we focus on what we can do for others rather than what we cannot do. Jesus says, as told by the Apostle Paul in Acts 20 and 35, it is more blessed to give than to receive. A remarkable example of this philosophy is found in the woman who anointed Jesus' head at Bethany in the home of Simon the leper. Some rebuked her extravagance, saying that she should have used the money to feed the poor rather than anoint the living. But Jesus commended her deed, saying, she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. A life that pours itself out for others and is willing to take risk in order to please the Master must find its focus on what can be done. And what cannot be done, Christ, uh, and what cannot be done in Christ, and what can be done in Christ are great things to the glory of God. Paul says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me in Philippians 4:13. With God as our helper, let us work together for the betterment of his kingdom and the praise of his glory. So we need to do what we can do. And I know sometimes we want to do more than that. And that's good to have that kind of desire and want. But don't don't not do something because you don't think it's enough. Because you'd be surprised how the littlest things bring great happiness to a lot of people. Prayers, letters, cards, telephone calls. It means a lot. If you're subject to the invitation tonight, please come forward as we stand and sing.